quick background. I was an organic commercial farmer in California, 37 years experience. I grew over 200 crops. I worked in all kinds of regions around the world. Yeah, yeah. Uh, and anyway, so I was the first farmer for Amy's Kitchen, Alice Waters, and Chez Panisse. I supplied to them. We also were in the vineyard deal. And now I've decided that it's time to get rid of chemical fertilizers. And so I spent probably like 16 years working on the way to do that. So one of the first problems is pest epidemics. That's one. And we can imagine all the problems that are using pesticides to control those. We've got a five-fold increase since 1960. U.S. farmers spent $14 billion on pest control. So what does that do? Goes in the ocean. 72 pesticides are banned in Europe, and we still use them. Yet there's 20 to 25% of the crops are lost to pests. Okay, so anyway, what's really happens there is we end up with chronic diseases in America. Oh, yeah? Yeah, probably better. So anyway, 6 to 10 adults in the U.S. have chronic disease. So basically what I'm trying to do is lead to the answer that also helps with this problem. So anyway, there's an example also of plague problems that happened in fields and so on. And we constantly have fungal diseases, and so we've got these agro-ecological imbalances that are going on, and they just aren't, people just can't, farmers keep like throwing things at it. One of the classic problems is they always have nutrient deficiencies. Oh, I've got nitrogen, I've got phosphorus, I got potash deficiencies. You know, and he was saying, oh, iron and so on. So that's a classic barrel not all filled, same problem. Here's an example of a nutrient deficiency, probably combination of salts, nitrogen, lack of magnesium. Mineral depletion in plants. Okay, from 1940 to 1901, the study found that copper declined by 76%, calcium. So anyway, we've got these ecology imbalances in major nutrients, and another thing that happens is that minerals are catalysts for enzymes, and so what happens, the minerals also impact our flavor. So if we got mineral imbalances and so on, so what's going on there? You know, how can we solve this? We're getting pretty addicted. Nitrate and ammonia fertilizers essentially are like drugs for us. Compromises the plant's immune system when you apply a huge amount, and you get these huge variations in agroecology. So then another thing happens, soil degradation, erosion, things like that. Example would be the world's losing 2,000 hectares of farmland daily to salt. Just in the Central Valley alone, it reduces the crop yield by 8 million tons per year. So how can we deal with that? That's what I spent all those years working on. So saline and sodic is a huge problem, but that's not the only one. Erosion, period. Soil compaction. Okay, so that reduces yields. So ideal soils versus soils that have a lot of air in them. So that's an ideal soil, and then it gets flocculated and salted up, compacted, and the roots can't move through the soil profile. Soil organic matter and erosion, so we all know these from many of the other people we're presenting today. What's low? Organic matter. Okay, climate variation. So that's going to be a real big deal going forward. How stabilizing your agroecology obviously is going to help create resilience, and that's a big deal. in the whole process. So anyway, example is infiltration of your soil. So obviously you got compacted soils. You're going to be, I mean, basically what I saw, most of what this flooding was in lands that were tilled. They're oxidized, they're, you know, compacted from tillage. And so oxidization is a huge deal. And also generally low, when they oxidize, they lower the organic matter. And so they're not holding moisture holding capacity they used to have. So this is a huge deal. And so what we're having is basically we're killing our soils. So then, of course, that also relates to our resilience via drought. So drought could be a real, you know, okay, so how are we going to store more water in our soils? And then, of course, what's running off? Chemicals, pesticides, salts, because we applied a great deal in the irrigation water, say, for instance. But actually, another thing happens is it goes down into the Gulf of Mexico, example, and creates a huge dead area. The dead zone is just massive now after that flooding period. So 50 out of 50 states. So this is all the bad stuff, okay? I'm giving you the things that really, you know, kind of depressing. But I think there's answers, and that's what I've been doing. But we need to really, okay, nail these things. What are they? So toxic algae blooms, they're huge. And we've been working a little bit in Florida, trying to get people thinking about other alternatives and going to point source, because that's really the problem, is not admitting that at the point, at the farm, there is actually a solution. So anyway, my attitude is that through returning the soil biodiversity, that's the way that we can solve these problems, basically, because each one of the organisms has a different role in controlling. Well, okay, we've got pesticides. They're ones that will help bioaccumulate, break them up, and ameliorate the problem in the soil. We've got problems with nitrate overdoses. There's certain biodiversity that can help with that. I don't know if you guys seen this movie, and this is a case of a biodiversity of plant species, but also biodiversity of animal, and just the whole idea of changing the farm style. I'm not, I think this was an extremely well-funded project, as we all know, but it just gives you a primer on what kind of investment we need to make in learning from nature. And here's an example. Okay, solution basically is beneficial microbes and insects defend plants and attack parasites. And that's basically my premise. You know, I was thinking all these years at my farm going, you know, nature doesn't really put on 10, 50 tons of compost on the land. What's going on here? And my father had given me a challenge. My father had said, you know, I don't get it. You know, there's no way you could do organic farming on all America with the lack of manure that we have. And so anyway, I was thinking, how can that happen? You know, it's frustrating. You know, every once in a while your manure spray would break down, and it's just quite frustrating. So anyway, as time went on, I had been down the Amazon, and I was studying, you know, mycorrhizal relationships between plants and crops and so on. And so basically what I discovered is that, you know, it's not all about the roots. It's the relationship between the roots and the plants. So, I mean, we're all talking about soil, not oil, but really it's a very intimate symbiosis that we're talking about, and basically endophytic microbiome. So, okay, imagine we have a microbiome in our gut. This is a microbiome in the plant. Then we eat the plant, and then the microbiome continues on. Okay, so I think what we really need to face facts are 70% of the soil microbiome is gone. It's not being uptaken by the plant. So then when we're eating it, that means 70% of all the microbiome for our gut is gone. So every time we eat, we're not being renewed. So this is part of the problem we're having. And so anyway, the way that Rhizosphere works is that basically plants put out these polysaccharide food supplies for them, and they blow up on them. And then they translocate up into the plant. And I think the major problem we have now is that we do not have the microbiome or the endophyte colonies anymore. We're down to 30% of what we had. And so what happens is you start getting micronutrient deficiencies, which is because, listen, it doesn't matter what the chemical structure is. If you don't have the biology there, it cannot bioadjust. The plant is dependent on the biology that's growing in it. And you can go get an electron microscope and you'd be blown away that inside plants there are these colonies flowing around inside there. We're talking about bacteria, proteobacteria, yeast, and fungi. I mean, it's complicated. But I think the primary thing is getting it back on the land. And in the short term, there's a lot of conventional farmers that can benefit from this tech. Solution: soil builds organic matter and consumes salts. So we put on back to this 70% of biome that's been taken away, and then it's taken up in the plant, and immediately you've got starting to get the carbon cycle is improved because your overall abundance of the plants is better, right? So this is all part of the whole answer to the problem. So look, for instance, the liquid carbon pathway, roots release exudates when they sense microbes. So if you had put it on the soil, they start to go, put out polysaccharides, yeah. And then they start to swim to this food source. And then they start, exploding on the food source. And then suddenly they go up inside the plant. And that's where what we're doing comes in. We kind of went ahead and selected special species that really do all the things that give the plants abundance. So for instance, just on the biodiversity balance and healthy plants thing. So abundance means that, so these exudates are coming out and the plants are growing and they take off, but they want to be able to follow along and find, water, nutrients, and so on. So it's there's a whole amazing thing going on there. Like, for instance, there's one bacteria called Rhodosudomonas palustris, which is related to earthworms. And it's like sending, a superconductor of electricity. So basically it shoots back and forth information to the plant, and the plant root just gets guided down these pathways. So what I'm actually doing now is I'm actually putting it back in. If there are no earthworms, if you can get that down in the soil, the glomulins, which actually host this bacteria that I'm talking about, the Rhodosudomonas palustris, then what happens is you can start to jumpstart the soil. So anyway, those are kind of your basic degraded soil problems. And so biological solutions mitigate runoff, obviously. So how can once we've got an abundant plants growing and they start taking off, what everybody's solution in regular farming is, let's apply nitrogen, they explode. But so what I'm doing is providing endophytic species that actually fix nitrogen in the leaves. So when the plant responds, it gives sugars to these endophytic species, and they blow up in the plant. They take nitrogen out of the air. And surprisingly, only 20% of the nitrogen-fixing species on the planet are in the roots. Everybody's thinking is, root nodules, but that's a very small percentage. What we need to do is get back these nitrogen-fixing species into the top of the plant. So 80% of the species of nitrogen-fixing species are actually in the leaves. So this is new information I just turning you on to that's only like 4 or 5 years old. After doing a whole, they do a whole test of all the species on the earth that we know of, because we're talking a lot of species we haven't even discovered yet. So anyway, this all kind of revolves around good practices too, and I think these are really books that show you good practices and how to, because honestly, what I'm saying is not a magic pill. It's important to be using regenerative agriculture systems, no-till, cover cropping, creative grazing, and all these things. And that really brings, so imagine I inoculated the cattle with this biome, and they go out and they start distributing it. These are the kind of things you need to start thinking about, is how does nature distribute? Oops, how did that happen? I think we're back here. So how does nature distribute? Maybe this is a question. I'm going to open it up a little bit. What insect spreads these microbiomes? All of them. Exactly. So when you have a pest problem, they're basically coming to inoculate because you made a mistake as humans, usually. In nature, that might also be a way that it can read up the abundance. I'll give you a quick classic story. I'm up in Berkeley, and I'm looking at this yard, and there's some junipers, and underneath the junipers is just literally millions of snails. And I'm like, that's crazy. And they're kind of up on the junipers, eating the junipers, and I'm like, interesting. How come that imbalance is happening? And it's more extreme. It's a plague. And so what I discovered is a few months later, they're dead. And it was just thousands of shells. And so what nature was doing was creating biohomeostasis. So agroecology is about finding biohomeostasis, trying to create a level playing field, fill that barrel all the way up. So imagine your barrel. One of those staves is starting to get low. Water comes out. Well, nature just suddenly inoculates and does a little bit of work there. So anyway, practices or products. Okay, so whole systems change. That's the key. Usually, to change your farm. For me, it seemed to I started seeing really major changes after 3 years. I had 15% organic matter. I had actually higher than the Kaisers, way up there. And yet, I still had agroecology imbalances. They have a lot of insect problems, and so those things could be dealt with through changing their microbiome. Maybe they've got too much wood fungal species, and then some of the insects are coming in for a reason. So again, those three major things: no-till, cover crop. Basically, what does nature do? It usually only does mulching. Very rare. So all three of those usually. So anyway, I happen to spend a lot of time. We finally created these two products. This one on the right is a biochar. So biochar is a carbon that's been cooked at like about 850 degrees, usually out of wood or almond shells or cogenerative materials. And the idea is it's a home. Inside there's millions of spaces in there. And what can happen is you ferment it in there, and they go inside the endophytic species, in our case, 640 species roughly, and they'll do a home situation. So when you apply it to your field, you not only have this cation in the form of carbon, which is just balances your cation exchange capacity. Does everybody know what that is? Okay, I guess it sounds like Anyway, the whole deal there is the cation exchange capacity is what the soil can exchangeability. And if you've got carbon as a major a major exchange element. It can be the balancer and everything. I think that's the basis there. But the most important thing is that whenever it rains, these biology can come out. And so what I do is a little different than most people are very focused on aerobic species. I'm focused on having both aerobic and anaerobic species, so they're called facultative species, so that when it does rain, they don't get knocked off. They actually can live in this kind of a situation. And then I also have a fermented liquid product that goes with it. So anyway, around that thinking is that leaf mold is essentially what nature does. And that's a cool process. It tends to be somewhat anaerobic. It's not a hot process. Nature rarely piles up huge amounts of organic matter. It just doesn't exist. It doesn't like landslides and things like that. So there is what they call landslide effects. And that's what we see sometimes. You see these lines of abundance after a landslide. So anyway, endophyte species are usually, as I said, they're these facultative, both anaerobic and aerobic, air and non-air species. Okay, so again, here's how so air tolerant anaerobes, they can tolerate it, but we're doing this is where we are. And most people are like thinking this, but imagine if it rains, you just knocked off a huge amount of your biome. So we want resilient biomes. Also, if you think about an insect, it's an aerobic gut. So that nature's doing this inoculation in aerobic gut. What other parts of this thing might be that if we're consuming, we're also anaerobic gut. So we want to keep this cycle moving around. And if 70% of the gut biome is gone because 70% of the soil microbes are gone because of chemical fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides, then it's time to start thinking about why are we having chronic disease? I mean, come on. The basis is that we are also, you see a lot of times people like, well, I feel better on organic food. Well, I noticed that. I was farming organic, and I got a certain amount of people saying, yes, I feel better eating your spinach. But then when I started doing research with facultative species, then I started getting people going, wow, I feel really good eating your spinach. And that whole thing turned into an amazing, almost like the fan club party, because when people are starting to feel good because they're eating your produce and they really notice it. I mean, we were feeding like 4,000 people, and you get a pretty good anecdotal evidence there. So anyway, there's a lot of precedent for what we're doing. We're basically doing fermenting of organic waste, but the idea is we're inoculating it. They were kind of crap shooting. I'm focusing on species that a lot of the things come originally from trees that are abundant, different sources that we've inoculated with. And how did that happen? So anyway, yeah. So this is kind of the basis of this idea that came from when I went down to the Amazon with the Missouri Botanical Garden. There, the concept was, why did those people in the Amazon able to live in a place that had just basically soil or clay, sand or clay? Very infertile soils, and we all know just from that lecture just a moment ago that black soils tend to be the fertile and rich. How is this happening? Okay, so anyway, basically what I noticed when I ground truth these places for the Missouri Botanical Garden is that there were these round circles with forests, and everything else was this infertile grassland. It was all red oxisol, which is very infertile soil. It's just, barely can support cattle. But these black forest soils had, 150-foot high trees on them, And that's where the villages were. So what I want to try to explain, this part of this deal, is that the women would, out the back of their houses, would have a big 1 meter size clay pot. And I saw a lot of this broken clay, and I was like, what's going on here? Apparently they'd cook chicha, usually out of corn, but they also use quinoa, different species in there, cassava, and they make this alcoholic drink. But old grandma, she would come by and she would spit into it, and that would be a low temperature fermentation because they would just barely have the fire going. And that was that 850 degrees charcoal we were talking about in the product that I created. So those are lactobacillus species. Okay, so that's very important in the decomposition of and conversion of organic matter. And so they had intuited, they didn't necessarily intuit, they were just throwing the charcoal out the backyard, but they didn't realize, but then they intuited it later, they were actually spreading on their fields, and it was the basis of their agriculture was this small addition of bio-inoculated charcoal. But they had some other intuitive discoveries. For instance, they discovered that a green ant, well, in our terminology, that's actually a termite, and termites are intimately related to the balance of phosphorus and potash. And so how is it in the middle of nowhere where there's no phosphorus, no potash, what was happening is they were farming fungus. And so their gut biome has a special fungus, so they were inoculating with that. So long story short, I've added that in, that gut biome that came from termites and things in there. So that way you can create this soil over here. And this soil over here, I'm just going to tell you a quick story. When I was down there, I was like hanging out with a Japanese farmer, younger guy, and I said, and then his father came by, and I asked his father, and I said, hey, how long have you guys, when's the last time you fertilized these papayas? And they said, oh, we've never fertilized them. And they were just giant, fat trunks, huge, never fertilized them. They were growing them on these soils on the left, terra pretas, which is a soil that, normally you wouldn't imagine. It's man-made. So it was just some amazing shamanistic intuitive effect that they discovered those two major things, that the keystone species, the termite, and the other one is our gut biome. Surprisingly, the connection we have with lignins and breakdown of organic matter. Okay, so anyway, here's an interesting little thing that just recently came this is what people thought up until 2011, and presently this is what we know now, that bacteria is a major part of the project, and lactobacillus bacteria is a major part of the project. And really, honestly, in growth of plants, you can see that, animals are involved because they're obviously insects and all that. So you can see this kind of gives you more about the microbial world, but it gives you also, if you think about, we're circles within circles within circles, and balancing those circles is what we're trying to do. So anyway, in order to validate what I'm doing, I decided, okay, well let's really check out our biology. And so we did there's a company that basically did, took our product, ground it up, and then did a sequencing and discovered that, yes, we were running in the right biosustainability. We got functionality. We got the hormones that we were looking for. And you know what? It wasn't about that. It was about that I used this product on my farm for 15 years and discovered huge production and so on. So interesting enough, I was getting strawberries like that, and my father was always like, Kathy, those things are going to taste like vegetables. They're too big, and they're all huge. And she said, just try them, Bill. So my dad tried them. He's like, oh, wow, that's the best damn strawberry I ever had. Oops. And so anyway, what we were finding is that the results spoke for themselves. How can we get out of chemical fertilizers? And a lot of it is just starting these processes with this biology and then getting into some more regenerative thinking so that it stabilizes everything. Cost-wise, it's pretty unbelievable, the difference. And down here's another example of stabilizing your agricultural ecology. See that one on the left? That's an olive leaf. 10 years he had olive leaves like that. They were all infected with olive spot bacterial, basically imbalance. A lot of it related to calcium. But then, boom, he got all his leaves doubled in size, and he looked like he was going to have the biggest olive set in his life. These are a few examples. These were some rolls up at Home Depot that were just trashed. The one on the left, I put Miracle Grow on it, and the one in the middle is our product. This is after 24 hours, and the one on the right there is just water. So you can see it just started greening up. Oops. And, of course, this guy here, he ended up with these massive cabbages, and I was getting these huge tomatoes, and they all tasted fantastic. And then the same thing with the ganja. Folks were discovering, that they were getting like 25% more buds. But also, the common problem with ganja is everybody's like, oh, they got a lot of ganja, but it tastes like wheat. It actually had really good smoke, so that was another aspect of it. So anyway, here's a picture. Just I don't know if that really shows conclusively in that photo, but so anyway, we got a good team here. Helen here, where's Daniel? He's around here somewhere. So anyway, this is the crew in the olive orchard, and the happy farmer in the middle, and he had 80 acres of olives and apples. So here's another thing about using liquid fertilizers that actually, so my thinking is, why did the farmer spending so much time on bioadjustment? Why don't we just put something in the liquid fertilizer that goes up inside the plant that is continually keeps the pest problem moderated? And so anyway, I think now it's time to open it up for any questions, because maybe that was a little fast, but any questions? Yes. Okay, so classically, you'll go down the road and you'll see like poplar trees, and they're all kind of yellowy. And you go a little farther, you'll see a deep green one. That might be an example. Poplars are notoriously can have nitrogen-fixing species. There's a lot of native species. So what we try to do is get a lot of diversity within that. There's also potassium and phosphorus bioaccumulators, things like that. It's surprising. So the way we work is we basically ferment everything over into life. And so this is the most important thing I'm going to say is we have no analysis in our fertilizer, none. Yes, really none. And so that is important when it goes into the ocean. Our major problem in the ocean is that we're just filling it full of fertility that before it was just in small amounts coming in. And that's our major problem. And if we can eliminate that part of the process. So now imagine you're sending into the ocean lactobacillus species, right? And you're no longer sending nitrogen in the form of chemical fertilizer into the ocean. That's what you're basically saying, hey, what species are doing it? So our job now is really start to understand how nature works. I think we basically didn't understand it. And we went into this chemical phase, and we're really suffering from it, honestly. It's a whole route there. Yeah, but to talk to you more about the nitrogen-fixing species, I mean, you would be surprised. You can go to land in the Amazon, and it's just sand. And you know, usually you think, oh, leguminaceous nitrogen-fixing species are the only ones. It's not the case. It turns out nitrogen-fixing species have been lost from a lot of plants, but in order to put them back, we are making it so that you can spray it on the plant and bring them back into food crops, because food crops basically lost them through agriculture and man's involvement. Yeah, Ron. Maybe we should talk to this. I mean, the number one problem I see when agrochemical companies decide to make a biological product is they end up with a very narrow set of species. And what happens is Fusarium is going to undergo a lot of changes in temperatures, and the plant's undergoing a lot of chemical variations. And if you don't have a high biodiversity to create immunity for the plant, one of the classic is how many types of penicillin can we inject into that biology. So penicillin, you could have like 36 species there and really benefit the overall immune stimulation of that plant, and then it won't go through this problem that he's talking about. I mean, this is critically important, and also having competitive fungal species, really important to have competitive fungal species whenever. So I've seen it a lot, you know, in Phytophthora. In plants or trees are declining, and we just spray underneath and irrigate, and then wow, about 3 days later, the tree's starting to recover. You can visually see it. I mean, this is the kind of thing, shot hole fungus, things like that. So we're just all about having a great deal of species of immune stimulation species in there. And, you know, we've pretty much seen it work. I've seen it especially in, like, Hawaii. They had a tremendous decline in the ohia tree, and we sent some over there, and the guys were like, wow, the ohia trees are recovering from when you put it on. So what's happened is we put it on a few ohia trees, and all it needs to do is blow around the islands because they lost it. You were spraying herbicides and putting chemical fertilizers on all the cane fields, and, you know, obviously it might have even affected the biomes up in the forest. So restoring that is really important. Other questions? Yeah, Johan? Well, I mean, obviously you're going to be applying something like we have, but I really think in that case you should be applying also inoculated biochar, so you have this constant, and you've also got a cation that will really help bioremediate. Everybody knows that if you got a problem in your gut, you have a little charcoal, and it's just amazing what it can do. I mean, this is a similar effect. Nature, you add. Here's what happens. Nature is getting a catastrophic situation. Fire comes through. It's renewing. It's bringing in fungal species next. And they're coming in. The fungal germinate. Then what happens is beetles start eating the mushrooms, and then birds come in, and they're spreading the biology from the beetles. So there's just some amazing cycles there. I think you're going to find, starting with
inoculated biochar in a very high rate, because I've done it before and seen it cure a lot of heavy metal problems, especially. Heavy metals they can be brought up into biology, and biology is amazing at, simplifying everything and enclosing it in proteins and so on. So that might be. Roundup, on the other hand, is not as difficult. I think you should really establish 6 to 7 years as time to ameliorate that problem. But then also you should put on our liquid into plants, and you should start doing cover crops. See if you can get them to come on. I mean, Roundup is not a systemic herbicide. It's only a foliar, and it just knocks it off. So really, that's not. You might have had more than one herbicide on that land. If it's dead completely, it's a multiple herbicide use. Any other questions? You had one. Yeah, so what I decided with my farm, I didn't want to deal with the problems like organic fertilizers were just ridiculous, like fish emulsion. They clog up the drip tape. So you can run our product through drip irrigation, or you can put it on foliar, so spray it on. You can drip it into the water if it's furrowed, or you can, spray it on the leaves. But in the inoculated biochar, I mean, I'm just going to give you an example. I used to have really small garlic, and, it was kind of depressing. It was up on kind of higher ground in the winter, and I put on inoculated biochar that was fermented in, and then it went up to like huge size garlic, and it just, those fields from then on were just really going from there. Yeah. Yeah, so when the stomata opens, so basically she wanted to say, she didn't realize that they were coming up inside the plant. Yeah, I mean, our classic image process is that, that's only in the roots is where the nitrogen-fixing species, and now new evidence shows 80% of the nitrogen-fixing species are actually in the leaves. And we're all kind of focused on they're inside the phloem, actually, and so they have a lot more space to move around. You can see them with an electron microscope swimming around, actually. A lot of the species are somewhere between red algae and blue-green algae. They're actually proteobacteria. So proteobacteria are even older than those two I just mentioned. They're where the bridge between bacteria and algae happens. So, yeah, so that's why, but they also are motile, which is a crazy aspect of them. They're motile. They actually have motile ability to swim. And so they'll go across the, root cell barrier. Any other questions on this? Because it's a topic that's just, just getting going, really, honestly. Yeah. Well, actinomycetes, on the other hand, are jointed. So what are you trying to say really about actinomycetes? Well, I mean, what is actinomycetes' role? I mean, they're amazing because when a fungus, which is more of a mycelia is, if you imagine a channel going through the plant into the plant, if you cut it, it'll show the plant wilt, and that's what you're talking about. There is the Fusarium wilts, and actinomycetes, if they're invaded, they stabilize the agroecology because they're jointed, and in there's a little bit of water in each one. And so what happens if you cut here, that water will move through this lamellae, this little membrane, and go into the next one, and it starts translocating water to the plant that it didn't before. So wilts are intimately related to with overinvasion of fungal species. And we're talking about an agroecology balance. We're talking a balance of things. And, we don't know everything, but I think when you see it works, yeah, I mean, does that kind of answer your question, or I didn't understand it? Well, we have them in there, so that's just the way it, if you want to use our product, you can. I mean, they're out there. Classic problem is people don't understand that life needs water. And when you take water away, you lose a lot of species, and you end up with species that are not going to return. And so I really believe in having water-based liquid fertilizer, biofertilizers, because you're not going to get them to inoculate. I mean, that's one of the reasons the gut in an insect is, it's liquid and alive. And, I don't know if you guys ever seen, the old Egyptian movies and the locusts attack every 7 years. Well, what are they doing? They're involved in this huge phosphorus cycle and probably an actinomycete inoculation. So we can do it. With my product, you can definitely do it. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, actinomycetes too, yeah. Yeah. How's that working? Exactly. You're talking Seth Peterson? Yeah, I actually gave him. Yeah, he's the one who sprayed it. So anyway, yeah, I think fear of we really are in the sanitization kind of thing, and it's amazing when you add diversity. I mean, we probably are nowhere near as healthy as our grandparents because of this whole lack therein. Rose's biology and her epidermal biology is probably not what her grandma's epidermal biology, but I think we can go back there. And that's, why, go and find those really green species out there in the wildlands and bring them back. And add those in, and it's amazing when you've got strength from in plants that are robustly strong, that they're going to probably end up helping her heal because they've got auxins, and there's these quite a few. What do they call it? Allicin would be one of the classic things. So there's an exudate from biology. I mean, we know that garlic puts out huge amounts of allicin, right? And that's an incredible healer of skin and so on. But it could be so crazy that it'll grow over a cut. So having a balance of, like, antimicrobial species. That's one thing that people just forget. Oh, where did all our antibiotics come from? Soil. Yeah. Everyone. I don't care if they thought it was just on mold on a piece of bread. It came from the soil originally. So what I'm saying is don't forget about that translocated effect, where what came in the soil will go up in the plant. If you want to short circuit it, in her case, I'll just give you an example. This guy had bamboo. He just poured the liquid fertilizer of ours on bamboo, and it was yellow up on the top, and literally it's 25 feet up. And 3 hours later, it was starting to green up. And he said, "Oh, what did you have in that stuff? Urine?" I said, "No, it was all just biology." And so, certain species really benefit from having endophyte colonies returned to them. Bamboo is a classic one. It was brought from Asia, and they just didn't get it. You look at Mexican bamboos; they're native. They're deep green. They have endophytes in them. Any other endophyte stories someone can tell us? Endophyte stories. Yeah, I think it's going to happen. We start to really return our thinking of how the connections that we have between insects, people's guts, pathology, and plants. And then the soil. I mean, the soil is where everything ends up, obviously, So I think I kind of added a little bit more to the soil, not oil story, I think. Is that it? 1 minute? Anybody else? It sounds like you should chop and drop. Well, here's a lot of classic example, is you just need to look into what you might have done that makes it possible for them to benefit. I mean, a classic example would be people discovered that star thistle was invading because it was low in phosphorus and potash, the land. And it's amazing if you put on chicken manure back on that land, boom, 2 years later, no more. But it might be a longer process than you think. Oh, it's a creek. What's the species? Oh, a Rundodonax. Yeah, Rundodonax, on the other hand, you might just want to get an ayahuasca club, come over and dig it up because it's got DMT in its roots. Yeah. You might want to be creative, think creative, but also either that or just realize that the cane is fantastic for making roofs, and it might be a great place to dump hempcrete on top of it. I mean, in Mexico, we built whole houses out of Rundodonax. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's it. Thank you.